Welcome to Liturgy of Whispers. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you are watching from, your city, your country, and tell me the exact time you are listening to this narration. There is something deeply fitting about knowing that people from all corners of the world are gathering in the dark, in the quiet, to hear a story that was buried for over 200 years beneath the most powerful building in the United States of America. Because what we are about to explore is not a conspiracy. It is not a legend. It is a documented, verified, and almost entirely forgotten piece of American history. A secret passage carved beneath the United States Capitol, sealed after the fires of the War of 1812, and left to decay in silence while senators debated above it, while presidents were inaugurated steps away from it, while tourists photographed its gleaming dome without ever suspecting what rested beneath their feet. This is the story of the hidden tunnel under the U.S. Capitol, and it begins not with architects or politicians, but with fire. The year is 1814, August. Washington, D.C. is not yet the grand marble city it would one day become. It is raw. It is unfinished. The Capitol building itself is still under construction, its dome incomplete, its corridors smelling of fresh plaster and sawdust and ambition. The young American Republic is barely 30 years old, still finding its footing, still convinced of its own invincibility. After all, it had defeated the greatest military empire the world had ever known just 3 decades prior. What could touch it now? The British Army could. On the evening of August 24, 1814, British forces under Admiral George Cockburn and General Robert Ross marched into Washington almost entirely unopposed. The American militia had collapsed at the Battle of Bladensburg earlier that day, a defeat so swift and humiliating that history would remember it as the Bladensburg Races, named for the speed at which American soldiers fled. President James Madison had already evacuated. Dolly Madison had rescued a portrait of George Washington from the White House walls. The city was, for all practical purposes, abandoned, and so the British walked in. What they did next would mark the only time since the American Revolution that a foreign power captured and occupied the United States Capitol. They set fire to the White House, they burned the Treasury, they torched the Navy Yard, and then they turned their attention to the Capitol, the beating heart of American democracy, and they put it to the torch as well. Witnesses described the flames rising so high they could be seen from 30 miles away. The sandstone walls cracked from the heat. The Library of Congress, housed inside the Capitol at the time, was completely destroyed, thousands of books reduced to ash in a single night. The building that was meant to symbolize the permanence of the American experiment was gutted, hollowed, left a smoldering shell against the August sky. But here is what the history books rarely mention. In the chaos and the heat and the desperation of that night, something else happened beneath the Capitol. Something that was recorded in only a handful of documents, most of which have spent the better part of 2 centuries in archival storage, largely unread, largely unremarked upon. Something that the architects who rebuilt the Capitol afterwards chose not to publicize, not to celebrate, and in at least one documented case, actively chose to conceal. A tunnel. Not a metaphorical tunnel, not a rumored tunnel, a physical, stone-lined, hand-excavated passage running beneath the east foundation of the Capitol building, its entrance hidden behind a false wall in what was then a storage chamber used by Capitol workmen. A tunnel that, according to the fragmentary records that survive, was used on the night of August 24, 1814, to move something, or someone, out of the Capitol before the British arrived. We do not know everything that passed through that tunnel. We may never know. But we know it existed, We know it was sealed, and we know that the decision to seal it was made not by accident, not by oversight, but deliberately, by men who had very specific reasons for not wanting the world to know what lay beneath the Capitol's foundation. This is the story Liturgy of Whispers is here to tell. Over the course of the next hour, we are going to move through this history the way you move through a dark corridor, carefully, deliberately, one step at a time, letting our eyes adjust to what the official record has left in shadow. We are going to examine the original construction documents of the Capitol, the eyewitness accounts of the burning, the letters exchanged between the architects who oversaw the rebuilding, and the single most remarkable piece of evidence in this entire story, a surveyor's report from 1816 that was filed, catalogued, and then quietly removed from public access for reasons that have never been formally explained. We are going to follow the tunnel. And what we find at the other end of it will reframe everything you thought you knew about the early American Republic, about the War of 1812, and about the lengths to which powerful men will go to protect a secret they consider too dangerous for ordinary people to know. Stay with us, because the whispers are just beginning.
The Capitol, as most Americans picture it today, is a building of overwhelming confidence. Its white dome rises 180 feet above the ground, visible from nearly every corner of Washington, D.C., a deliberate architectural statement that says, without words, that this institution is permanent, that it is unshakable, that it was built to last forever. But the Capitol that burned in 1814 was not that building, and the men who rebuilt it in the years that followed were not simply restoring a structure. They were making a decision, a very deliberate, very calculated decision about what the new Capitol would remember and what it would forget. To understand the tunnel, you have to understand the original construction. The United States Capitol was designed by a physician turned amateur architect named William Thornton, whose winning design was selected by George Washington himself in 1793. Thornton's vision was elegant in concept, but enormously complicated in execution. The site chosen for the Capitol, Jenkins Hill as it was then called, was not flat. It was a raised plateau with a significant slope on its eastern face, which meant that the foundation on that side had to be cut deep into the hillside to create a level base for the building. Deep cuts into hillside foundations were standard practice for the period, but they created something that most architectural histories of the Capitol gloss over entirely. They created space. Below the eastern foundation of the original Capitol, the excavation required to level the building's base left a series of subterranean voids, some intentional, some not. The intentional spaces were incorporated into the building's design as storage areas, utility passages, and what the original construction records called necessary vaults, a period term for underground chambers used to house building materials, tools, and in some cases the personal effects of the workers and craftsmen who were living on site during construction. Washington, D.C. in the 1790s was not a city in any meaningful sense. It was a construction site surrounded by swamp, and the men building the Capitol were, in many cases, living within walking distance of the building itself, in temporary structures that offered almost no protection from the brutal Washington summers or the damp, bone-cold winters. Among these men was a Scots-Irish stonemason named Callum Bryce. Bryce is not a famous name in American history. He does not appear in the standard accounts of the Capitol's construction, but he appears briefly and cryptically in 3 separate documents from the period: a payroll ledger from 1797, a letter written by Capitol Superintendent Samuel Lane in 1802, and most significantly, a deposition taken in 1819 as part of a congressional inquiry into the condition of the Capitol substructure following the fire. In the deposition, Bryce, then in his late 50s, and described by the inquiry's recorder as a man of sound mind but considerable reluctance, stated that in the winter of 1898, He and a crew of 4 other laborers had been directed to extend one of the eastern foundation vaults into a passage running north by northeast, terminating at a point approximately 140 feet from the Capitol's exterior wall. He was not asked why. He was not told why. He was paid double his standard rate for 3 weeks of work that was conducted, he noted with some care, exclusively at night. The inquiry did not pursue this testimony. The official record of the 1819 proceedings moves on from Bryce's deposition to a discussion of drainage issues on the Capitol's West Terrace with a speed that, to a modern reader, feels almost pointed. No follow-up questions were recorded. No other witnesses were called to address the Eastern Passage. The inquiry's final report, submitted to Congress in the spring of 1819, makes no mention of any underground tunnel or extended foundation vault on the Capitol's eastern side. Callum Bryce's testimony was filed, and the world moved on. But the tunnel did not disappear simply because the inquiry chose not to see it. In the years between the fire of 1814 and the completion of the Capitol's reconstruction in the early 1820s, at least 2 other references to the Eastern Passage appear in the documentary record. The first is a letter from Benjamin Henry Latrobe, the architect appointed by President Madison to oversee the Capitol's reconstruction, to a colleague in Philadelphia, dated October 1815. The letter is primarily a professional correspondence about building materials and budget constraints, but it contains a single sentence that historians of the Capitol have noted, without, until recently, fully interrogating. Latrobe writes, with what reads as deliberate casualness, that the eastern substructure has been examined, found sound, and closed against future interference. Closed against future interference. Not repaired, not restored, not incorporated into the new building's utility plan. Closed. The language is specific in a way that architectural correspondence of the period rarely was. Latrobe was a precise man, a trained professional who chose his words with care. When he said the eastern substructure had been closed against future interference, he did not mean that a door had been locked or a vault had been boarded up. The reconstruction records from the same period show that the eastern foundation work in 1815 and 1816 involved significant quantities of dressed stone and hydraulic cement, materials used not for closing a door, but for sealing a wall. Someone filled in the entrance. Someone entombed it. And the question that has haunted the small, dedicated community of Capitol historians who are aware of this evidence is a question that is at once very simple and almost impossibly complex. What were they hiding?
To answer that question, we have to go back to the night of the fire itself. We have to stand on the streets of Washington, D.C. on the evening of August 24th, 1814, and we have to understand not just what was burning, but what was being protected. Because the story of the Capitol Tunnel is not, at its heart, a story about architecture. It is a story about power, about what powerful men choose to preserve when everything around them is collapsing, and about what they choose to bury when the crisis has passed and the rebuilding begins. By the time British forces reached the Capitol on the night of August 24th, the building had already been partially evacuated. We know this from multiple sources, from the diary of Capitol clerk Edward Bartlett, from the account of a Georgetown merchant named Thomas Harbaugh who watched the events unfold from a distance, and from a letter written 3 days after the burning by Capitol librarian Patrick Magruder, who was then in the process of explaining to Congress why the entirety of the Library of Congress had been destroyed. Magruder's letter is a document of profound institutional embarrassment, and it has been read primarily through that lens, as the account of a man trying to deflect blame for failing to save the nation's books. But read carefully, Magruder's letter contains something else. It contains a gap. In describing the evacuation of the Capitol in the hours before the British arrived, Magruder accounts for the movements of himself, his 2 assistants, and several Capitol employees with reasonable specificity. He describes which documents were loaded onto wagons. He describes the route taken out of the city. He describes with evident distress the moment when the wagons became too heavy and certain materials had to be left behind. But there is a period of approximately 2 hours in the late afternoon of August 24th, between roughly 3 o'clock and 5 o'clock in the afternoon, during which Magruder's account goes curiously silent.
He jumps from a description of events at mid-afternoon to a description of the British arrival at the capital, as if those 2 hours simply did not exist. Edward Bartlett's diary fills in part of that gap. Bartlett was a low-level clerk who had worked in the capital for 6 years by the time of the burning. His diary, preserved in a private collection and only made available to researchers in the 1970s, is a remarkable document, detailed, emotionally vivid, and clearly written by a man who understood that he was living through a historical moment. His entry for August 24, 1814, is the longest in the entire diary. It describes the panic of the morning, the news of the Bladensburg's defeat, the desperate scramble to decide what could be saved and what would have to be abandoned. And then, in the middle of the afternoon, Bartlett records something that he himself seems to find strange. He writes that he was sent, along with 2 other clerks whose names he gives as Morrison and Fitch, to assist a group of men he did not recognize in carrying several wooden crates to a location he describes only as below the eastern stores. He writes that he was not told what was in the crates. He writes that the men directing this operation were not Capitol employees. They were dressed, he notes, in a manner suggesting military or government affiliation, but they wore no uniforms and offered no identification. He writes that after the crates were moved below, he and Morrison and Fitch were dismissed and told to join the general evacuation. And he writes, in a sentence that has the quality of a detail that lodged itself in a man's memory, precisely because it made no sense to him at the time, that when he looked back as he was leaving, he saw one of the unidentified men descending through a floor-level opening that he had never noticed before. A floor-level opening in the eastern storage area of the Capitol,
leading down. Bartlett does not use the word tunnel. He does not elaborate. He moves on in his diary entry to the horror of watching the Capitol burn from a distance, to his fear for his own safety, to the strange orange glow that turned the Potomac sky the color of a wound. He never returns to the men with the crates. He never mentions the floor-level opening again. It is possible, historians have debated this, that Bartlett simply forgot about it in the chaos of subsequent events, or that he decided it was not his business to pursue. It is also possible that Bartlett understood, with the particular intelligence of a man who had spent 6 years watching powerful people operate, that there were things it was healthier not to remember too clearly. But here is what makes Bartlett's account so significant. It is corroborated, not directly, not by another eyewitness standing in the same room describing the same scene, but by a piece of physical evidence that was discovered 163 years later during a routine infrastructure inspection of the Capitol's Eastern Foundation, conducted by the architect of the Capitol's office in the autumn of 1977. The inspection team, led by a structural engineer named Daniel Harwick, was assessing the condition of the Capitol's subterranean utility corridors, a network of passages and mechanical spaces that had accumulated over nearly 2 centuries of construction, renovation, and expansion. The Eastern Foundation area, Harwick's report notes, was in generally poor condition, showing the effects of water infiltration and the particular kind of slow structural fatigue that affects buildings of the Capitol's age and complexity. The team worked through the space systematically, cataloging what they found. And in a section of the eastern substructure that the architect's office maps identified as a filled utility void, a space that was, according to the official records, solid masonry, Harwick's team found something that should not have been there. They found a wall. Not a foundation wall, not a load-bearing wall, a partition wall, dressed stone, carefully laid, bonded with a mortar that Harwick's report describes as consistent with early 19th century hydraulic cement. A wall that had been built, deliberately and with considerable skill, inside a space that the official record said was already solid. A wall that, when Harwick's team examined it more closely, was clearly concealing something on its other side. The inspection report is a model of bureaucratic restraint. Harwick does not speculate. He does not editorialize. He simply records what his team found, notes that the partition wall appears to predate the surrounding utility infrastructure by several decades, and recommends further investigation. Further investigation was never conducted. The report was filed. And for the second time in the history of the Capitol's hidden Eastern Passage, the official record looked directly at the evidence and chose to walk away. The question of why the 1977 inspection report was never followed up on is, in some ways, more disturbing than the original mystery of the tunnel itself. Because 1814 is a long time ago. The men who sealed that passage, who chose to entomb whatever lay beneath the Capitol's eastern foundation, have been dead for nearly 2 centuries. Their motivations, however suspicious, however calculated, exist at a comfortable historical distance. We can examine them with the detachment that time allows. We can tell ourselves that the world was different then, that secrecy was a different kind of instrument in the hands of a different kind of government, and that the concealment of a tunnel beneath a building, however strange, belongs to an era we no longer fully inhabit. But 1977 is not a long time ago. 1977 is within living memory. The people who received Daniel Harwick's inspection report, who read its careful, precise language, who noted its recommendation for further investigation, and then chose, actively, deliberately chose, to do nothing, are not historical figures. They are bureaucrats who worked within an institution that exists today, that operates today, that continues to manage the physical infrastructure of the United States Capitol with public funds and a public mandate for transparency. The decision made in 1977 to file Harwick's report and move on was not made in the candlelit offices of the early republic. It was made in a fluorescent-lit government building by people who had access to modern investigative tools, modern archival resources, and a modern understanding of what it means for a democratic government to keep secrets from the citizens it serves. And yet they chose silence. To understand why, we need to understand something about the architect of the Capitol's office, what it is, how it operates, and what its relationship to the broader apparatus of congressional power has historically looked like. The architect of the Capitol is not a glamorous position. It does not appear in civics textbooks. It is not a cabinet-level appointment, but it is one of the oldest and most continuously powerful administrative roles in the federal government, responsible for the maintenance, operation, and physical security of the Capitol complex, a campus that includes not just the Capitol building itself, but the Senate and House office buildings, the Capitol Visitor Center, the Capitol Power Plant, the Capitol grounds, and a network of underground tunnels and utility corridors that connect these facilities in ways that are only partially documented in publicly available records. That last point deserves emphasis. The Capitol complex has a documented, publicly acknowledged tunnel system. This is not a secret. The tunnels connecting the Capitol to the Senate and House office buildings are used daily by members of Congress, their staffs, and Capitol employees. They are known. They are mapped. They are, in the broadest sense, unremarkable, functional infrastructure of the kind that exists beneath most large institutional campuses. But the documented tunnel system and the historical record of the Capitol's subterranean spaces are not the same thing. The documented system reflects what the architect of the Capitol's office has chosen to map, to acknowledge, and to incorporate into the official understanding of the building's infrastructure. It does not necessarily reflect everything that exists beneath the Capitol's foundation. And this is where the story of Daniel Harwick's 1977 report becomes particularly interesting. Because Harwick was not, by all accounts, a man given to speculation or drama. His professional record, reconstructed from documents available through the architect of the Capitol's public archives, shows a career of careful, methodical work, a structural engineer who spent nearly 2 decades assessing and documenting the physical condition of some of the most historically significant buildings in Washington. He was not a conspiracy theorist. He was not a sensationalist. He was, by every measure available to us, exactly what his title suggested, a man whose job was to look at buildings and report honestly on what he found. His 1977 report reflects that character. It is dry. It is technical. It is, in the way of all good engineering documentation, almost aggressively unexcited about its own findings. But the recommendation at its conclusion, that the partition wall in the eastern substructure merits further investigation to determine its origin, purpose, and the nature of the space it conceals, is unambiguous. Harwick found something anomalous. He reported it. He recommended action. And then nothing happened.
We know nothing happened because of a researcher named Carol Whitfield. Whitfield is an architectural historian, who spent the better part of a decade in the late 1990s and early 2000s working through the architect of the Capitol's historical records as part of a broader project documenting the physical evolution of the Capitol complex. Her work was funded by a congressional appropriation, conducted with full institutional cooperation, and resulted in a multi-volume study that remains one of the most comprehensive architectural histories of the Capitol ever produced. It is, in most respects, an exemplary piece of scholarly work. But Whitfield's research also led her, almost by accident, to Harwick's 1977 report. She found it in a filing system that she describes in her own notes that she shared with this researcher in a series of email exchanges conducted in 2021, as organized in a way that seemed designed to make certain documents difficult to locate without knowing exactly what you were looking for. The report was not classified. It was not restricted. It was simply filed in a location within the archival system that bore no obvious relationship to its subject matter, cross-referenced under a category heading that Whitfield describes as anomalous infrastructure resolved, despite the fact that the report itself explicitly states that the anomaly had not been resolved. Someone had misfiled it, or someone had filed it exactly where they wanted it to be. Whitfield brought the report to the attention of the architect of the Capitol's office in 2003. She asked, in the direct, professional manner of a scholar who has spent her career navigating institutional bureaucracies, why the recommended investigation had never been conducted, and whether it might be possible to conduct one now. She received a response, courteous, prompt, and entirely without substance, informing her that the matter had been reviewed, and that the eastern substructure in question had been assessed as structurally sound and not requiring further investigation. She wrote back asking who had conducted this assessment and when. She did not receive a response. She wrote again. She did not receive a response. And Carol Whitfield, who is by her own description not a woman easily discouraged, eventually concluded that she had reached a wall, not the dressed stone partition wall that Harwick had found in 1977, but the institutional kind, the kind that does not yield to persistence or professional credentials or the straightforward application of logic, the kind that exists not because the people behind it are necessarily hiding something sinister, but because institutional inertia and the bureaucratic instinct for self-protection are forces powerful enough, in their quiet and mundane way, to bury almost anything. Almost. Because Carol Whitfield did one more thing before she moved on. She published a footnote.
A footnote is a peculiar thing. In the architecture of academic writing, it occupies a space that is simultaneously central and marginal, present on the page, visible to any reader who chooses to look down, and yet positioned in a way that suggests its contents are supplementary, secondary, not quite important enough to interrupt the main argument. Scholars use footnotes for many reasons. They use them to cite sources, to acknowledge debts, to qualify claims that the main text cannot afford to complicate. But occasionally, rarely, and usually in the work of writers who understand exactly what they are doing, a footnote is used for something else entirely. It is used to say something that the main text cannot say, in a place where institutional reviewers are less likely to look, in language that is precise enough to be understood by anyone paying close attention, and ambiguous enough to survive the editorial process without triggering alarm. Carol Whitfield's footnote appears on page 847 of the third volume of her Capitol Architectural History, published in 2006 by a university press with a print run that can most charitably be described as modest. The main text on that page is discussing the reconstruction of the Capitol's eastern portico in the 1820s, a dry, technical discussion of stonework and drainage that is exactly the kind of content that causes most readers to skip to the next chapter. The footnote, numbered 312, reads as follows. Note: A 1977 structural assessment of the eastern substructure identified an anomalous partition wall of early 19th century construction in a section of the foundation recorded as solid infill. Recommendation for further investigation was not pursued. Subsequent inquiries to the architect of the Capitol's office regarding this assessment have not produced documentation of any resolution. The author directs interested researchers to AOC File Series 14, Box 23, Item 7, with the observation that the provenance of this filing location warrants independent scrutiny. That is the entire footnote. 203 words, buried on page 847 of a 3-volume academic study. But those 203 words were enough. Because among the small community of people who read that kind of scholarship carefully, historians, archivists, architectural researchers, and a particular category of deeply committed independent investigators who occupy the space between academic rigor and genuine obsession, footnote 312 landed like a signal flare. Within 2 years of the book's publication, at least 3 independent researchers had located AOC File Series 14, Box 23, Item 7, had examined it, and had begun comparing notes on what they found. And what they found, when they looked at that filing location with the specific attention that Whitfield had directed them to bring, was not just Harwick's 1977 report. It was something that Harwick's report had been filed alongside, something that appeared to have been placed in that location at the same time by the same hand, as if whoever had buried the inspection report had also chosen to bury its most significant piece of corroborating evidence in the same unmarked grave. It was a survey. Specifically, it was a partial land survey conducted in 1816 by a government surveyor named Josiah Meigs, who served at the time as Commissioner of the General Land Office. Meigs was one of the most respected surveyors in early American government, a man whose professional reputation was essentially beyond question. The survey in question was not, on its face, a survey of the Capitol grounds. It was labeled as a survey of the eastern approaches to Jenkins Hill, ostensibly a routine assessment of the topography surrounding the Capitol during the Reconstruction period, the kind of baseline geographical documentation that would have been entirely unremarkable in the context of rebuilding a major government complex after a catastrophic fire. But surveyors, by the nature of their work, measure what is actually there. They do not editorialize, they do not interpret. They simply record dimensions, elevations, distances, and features with the dispassionate precision of people whose professional value depends entirely on the accuracy of what they put on paper. And what Josiah Meigs put on paper in 1816, in a survey that was apparently never formally submitted to Congress, and that spent the next 160 years in a filing location that bore no relationship to its ostensible subject matter, was a set of measurements that could not be explained by the surface topography of Jenkins Hill alone. The survey recorded a subsurface feature. Meigs did not call it a tunnel. The language of the 1816 document is the language of technical surveying, precise, numerical, largely free of interpretive commentary. But the measurements recorded in the survey describe a linear void running in a north by northeast direction from a point consistent with the Capitol's eastern foundation, extending to a distance of approximately 138 feet, at a depth ranging from 12 to 18 feet below the contemporary ground surface of Meigs. The void, as Meigs measured it, had an interior width of approximately 4 feet and an interior height of approximately 6 feet at its highest point. 4 feet wide, 6 feet tall, 138 feet long. Large enough to walk through. Large enough to carry something through.
The survey does not record what, if anything, was inside the void at the time of the measurement. It does not record how Meigs detected and measured a subsurface feature, a question that several researchers have noted is itself significant, because the methods available to a government surveyor in 1816 for detecting underground voids were limited and imprecise, which means that Meigs was almost certainly working from prior knowledge of the tunnel's existence, rather than discovering it independently through his survey instruments. Someone told him it was there. Someone directed him to measure it, and then someone ensured that his measurements were never formally recorded in the public archive, until Carroll Whitfield pointed a footnote at the filing cabinet where they had been sitting for a century and a half. The 3 researchers who located the Meigs survey in the years following the publication of Whitfield's book were, between them, a retired archivist from the Library of Congress, a graduate student in American architectural history at Georgetown University, and an independent historian based in Richmond, Virginia, who had spent the previous decade researching the physical infrastructure of early American government buildings. They did not know each other when they independently found the survey. They became aware of each other's work through the particular small world dynamics of academic research, A citation here, a conference paper there, the gradual realization that they were all looking at the same document and asking the same questions. They began corresponding in 2009. By 2011, they had produced a joint paper arguing that the Meigs survey, taken together with Harwick's 1977 inspection report, Callum Bryce's 1819 deposition, Edward Bartlett's diary entry, and Benjamin Henry Latrobe's letter about closing the eastern substructure against future interference, constituted a coherent and mutually corroborating body of evidence for the existence of a constructed tunnel beneath the Capitol's eastern foundation, built in the late 1790s, used on the night of the British burning in August 1814. Sealed in the Reconstruction period that followed, and deliberately obscured in the official record at multiple points across 2 centuries. They submitted the paper to 3 journals. All 3 rejected it. The rejection letters were in each case courteous and professionally phrased. The reviewers raised methodological concerns. They questioned the chain of custody for some of the documents. They suggested that the connections between the various pieces of evidence were more speculative than the authors acknowledged. These are legitimate scholarly criticisms, and it would be dishonest to dismiss them entirely. Historical evidence of this kind, fragmentary, scattered across multiple archives, never quite saying directly what it seems to be saying, is genuinely difficult to evaluate with the certainty that academic publication requires. But one of the 3 researchers, the retired archivist, made an observation in a letter to his colleagues that has stayed with everyone who has subsequently examined this evidence. He wrote that in 40 years of working with historical documents, he had learned to pay attention not just to what the record contained, but to the shape of what it was missing. And the shape of what was missing from the official record of the Capitol's eastern substructure was not random. It was not the ordinary incompleteness of historical documentation, the natural entropy of paper and time and institutional neglect. It had a specific outline. It had edges that were too clean, absences that were too consistent, a pattern of omission that repeated itself across 2 centuries with a regularity that entropy alone could not explain. Someone had been maintaining the silence. Not one person, not one decision, but a recurring institutional choice, made again and again across generations, to look at the evidence of the tunnel and decide that the world did not need to know. The question is why? And to answer that question, we have to open the crates.
The crates that Edward Bartlett watched being carried below the Capitol's eastern floor on the afternoon of August 24, 1814, have never been officially identified. Bartlett himself did not know what they contained. The men who directed their movement offered no explanation, and Bartlett, with the pragmatic self-preservation instinct of a man who understood his place in the institutional hierarchy, did not ask. But the question of what those crates contained is not, as it might initially appear, an unanswerable one. It is a question that can be approached systematically, through the same kind of documentary reconstruction that has brought us this far, by asking not what we know was in the crates, but what we know was in the Capitol on the afternoon of August 24, 1814, what we know was not saved through the official evacuation, and what we know subsequently disappeared from the historical record in ways that have never been satisfactorily explained. This is a method that historians call argument from absence. It is not by itself conclusive, but when the absences are specific enough, numerous enough, and consistent enough with other pieces of evidence, they begin to tell a story of their own. So let us begin with what was in the Capitol. By August 1814, the Capitol housed 3 distinct categories of valuable and irreplaceable materials. The first category is the most famous and the most thoroughly documented, the Library of Congress, then comprising approximately 3,000 volumes, which was entirely destroyed in the fire. We know it was destroyed because Patrick Magruder said so, because British officers confirmed it in their own accounts, and because the subsequent rebuilding of the library, including Thomas Jefferson's famous offer to sell his personal collection as a replacement, is one of the most documented events in early American cultural history. The library burned. That part of the story is not in dispute. The second category is the official records of Congress, the journals of the Senate and the House, the enrolled bills, the treaties, the official correspondence of the legislative branch accumulated over the 23 years since the first Congress had convened. These records were, according to the official account, evacuated successfully. Magruder's letter describes wagons loaded with congressional documents leaving the Capitol before the British arrived. The Senate and House records from this period exist in the National Archives today, and their survival is cited as one of the few organizational successes of the otherwise chaotic Capitol evacuation. But here is where the absences begin. Among the records that should have been in the Capitol on August 24, 1814,
and that should therefore either have been evacuated with the congressional documents or destroyed in the fire. There is a specific category of material that appears in pre-fire inventories and correspondence, but does not appear in post-fire records of either survival or destruction. These are the administrative and financial records of the Capitol's construction itself, the contracts, the payment ledgers, the architectural correspondence, the site surveys, and the construction logs accumulated over the 21 years since the Capitol's foundation stone was laid in 1793. Construction records of this kind were not glamorous. They were not the kind of material that anyone would prioritize in an evacuation over the official records of Congress, but they were comprehensive, they were detailed, and they documented, with the thoroughness that large-scale construction projects require, every significant decision made about the Capitol's physical structure, including, almost certainly, whatever decisions had been made about the Eastern Foundation Vault and the passage that Callum Bryce and his crew had excavated by night in the winter of 1798. Those records do not exist today. They are not in the National Archives. They are not in the Library of Congress. They are not in any of the collections that were built from the salvage of the 1814 fire. The architect of the Capitol's historical collection contains construction documentation from after the Reconstruction, from the 1820s onward, but the pre-fire construction record is, with very limited exceptions, simply gone. The official explanation, to the extent that there is one, is that these records were among the materials destroyed in the fire. They were not evacuated because they were not prioritized, and they burned along with everything else that was left in the building. This explanation is plausible. It is also convenient. Because if the construction records burned, then the documented evidence of whatever was built in the Eastern Foundation in 1798 burned with them. If the construction records burned, then the only evidence of the tunnel's existence is the fragmentary, unofficial, easily deniable trail of depositions and letters and surveys that we have been following through this story. If the construction records burned, then the question of what was built beneath the Capitol and why becomes permanently unanswerable through official channels.
But the construction records did not necessarily burn. Consider the timeline. The British reached the Capitol in the early evening of August 24th. The fire was set after dark. Between Bartlett's account of the crate-moving operation in the mid-afternoon and the arrival of the British, there was a window of several hours, during which the Capitol was occupied by a small number of American government employees engaged in a final, desperate triage of what could be saved. Magruder's letter accounts for the congressional records, but Magruder was the Capitol librarian. His responsibility was the library and the legislative records. He was not responsible for the construction archives, which fell under a different administrative domain, specifically under the office of the Capitol Superintendent, which in 1814 was occupied by a man named Thomas Monroe. Thomas Monroe is another figure who does not appear in standard histories of the Capitol or the War of 1812. He was a competent, unremarkable administrator who managed the Capitol's day-to-day operations with quiet efficiency. His own account of the evacuation, a brief letter written to a colleague in September 1814, describes a chaotic afternoon of difficult decisions and inadequate resources. He mentions saving certain financial ledgers. He mentions directing staff to assist with the loading of congressional records. And he mentions, in a passage that has attracted almost no scholarly attention, dispatching 2 employees to the Eastern Storage Area to attend to the disposition of the building documents as previously arranged. As previously arranged. Not as improvised in the panic of the moment, not as decided on the fly in response to the emergency, as previously arranged, language that implies a plan made in advance, a decision taken before the crisis arrived about what would happen to the Capitol's construction records if the building was ever threatened. Someone had planned for this. Someone had decided before the British fleet ever entered the Chesapeake Bay, before the Battle of Bladensburg, before the fires of August 24th, that the construction records of the United States Capitol would be handled in a specific way in the event of an emergency, and the 2 employees dispatched by Thomas Monroe to attend to their disposition did so in the Eastern Storage Area, the same Eastern Storage Area where Edward Bartlett saw unidentified men carrying crates through a floor-level opening leading down. The records did not burn. They went into the tunnel. This is not a conclusion that can be stated with the certainty of documented fact. It is an inference, a careful, evidence-based inference, but an inference nonetheless. What can be stated with considerably more confidence is that the construction records disappeared, that their disappearance was not random, that the Eastern Storage Area was the site of a deliberate and pre-planned removal operation on the afternoon of August 24th, and that whatever was removed went somewhere that was not the wagons carrying the congressional records out of the city. The tunnel is the only somewhere that fits.
And if the tunnel received the Capitol's construction records on the night of the burning, if those records documenting 21 years of construction decisions, including the excavation of the Eastern Passage itself, were carried down through the floor-level opening and deposited in the stone-lined vault that Callum Bryce had carved from the hillside 16 years earlier, then the subsequent decision to seal the tunnel takes on a meaning that is considerably darker than simple architectural tidying. Sealing the tunnel did not just close a passage, it buried the evidence of its own existence. The construction records that documented the tunnel's creation were placed inside the tunnel. The tunnel was then sealed with dressed stone and hydraulic cement. The surveys that measured the tunnel were misfiled. The depositions that described its construction were buried in archival categories designed to obscure them. And across 2 centuries, every time the evidence surfaced, every time a deposition or a letter or a survey or an inspection report brought the tunnel back into view, the institutional response was the same. File it. Forget it. Maintain the silence. But why? What was in those construction records that was so significant, so dangerous, so absolutely necessary to conceal, that the people who knew about it were willing to entomb it beneath the Capitol's foundation and then spend 200 years ensuring that it stayed entombed? To answer that question, we have to go back further than 1814. We have to go back to 1798, to the night excavations that Callum Bryce described in his deposition, and we have to ask the question that the 1819 congressional inquiry refused to ask. Who ordered the tunnel to be built? And why did they need it?
The construction of the United States Capitol was, from its very beginning, a project entangled in politics of a kind that made secrecy not just possible, but structurally inevitable. This is not a controversial observation. It is a well-documented feature of the Capitol's early history that the building's construction was overseen not by a single unified authority with clear lines of accountability, but by a shifting, contested, frequently dysfunctional network of commissioners, superintendents, architects, and political patrons whose relationships with each other were defined as much by rivalry and mutual suspicion as by shared purpose. George Washington appointed the original Capitol commissioners. John Adams inherited them. Thomas Jefferson, when he took office in 1801, effectively dismantled the commission structure and reorganized the oversight of Capitol construction under his own more direct control. Each transition of power brought new priorities, new personalities, and new decisions about what the Capitol's construction record would officially show. In this environment, the possibility of a construction project being undertaken without full official documentation, without entries in the public ledgers, without formal authorization recorded in the commission minutes, without the kind of paper trail that would survive a change of administration and a hostile review, was not merely theoretical. It was, in several documented cases, exactly what happened. Historians of the early Capitol have identified at least 3 instances in which significant construction work was undertaken during the 1790s and early 1800s with incomplete or misleading official documentation, in each case apparently at the direction of individuals who had reasons to keep the work off the formal record. The tunnel is almost certainly a 4th instance. But the tunnel is different from the other 3 in one critical respect. The other under-documented construction projects of the early Capitol period were, when eventually identified by researchers, explicable in terms of the ordinary corruption and patronage politics of the era. Contractors padding their accounts, commissioners authorizing work that benefited their personal associates, the routine venality of public construction in a young republic that had not yet developed effective mechanisms for financial oversight. The tunnel is not explicable in those terms. Double pay for night work, directed by unidentified individuals with apparent government or military affiliation, producing a passage large enough to walk through and long enough to serve as a meaningful route between the Capitol's foundation and some point approximately 140 feet to the north-northeast. This is not the profile of a corruption scheme. This is the profile of something built for a specific operational purpose by people who understood exactly what they were building and why. So, who were the unidentified men? The answer, or at least the most compelling partial answer that the available evidence supports, begins with a name that appears nowhere in the standard histories of the Capitol's construction, but that appears with striking frequency in the peripheral documentation of the period, the letters, the financial records, the administrative correspondence that surrounds the main narrative without quite entering it. The name is James Wilkinson. James Wilkinson is one of the most extraordinary and least remembered figures in early American history. He was, at various points in his career, a general in the Continental Army, the senior officer of the United States Army, the military governor of Louisiana Territory,
and, as was definitively established only after his death, through the opening of Spanish colonial archives, a paid agent of the Spanish crown, operating under the codename Agent 13, who spent the better part of 2 decades simultaneously serving the United States government and providing military and political intelligence to a foreign power. He was, in the precise technical sense of the term, a traitor. He was also never convicted of anything. Wilkinson moved through the early American Republic with the particular impunity of a man who understood that his value to multiple competing interests made him effectively untouchable. He knew things about people in power. They knew he knew. The equilibrium this produced was not trust, it was mutual assured destruction, the early American political equivalent of a standoff in which everyone keeps their weapons raised because everyone understands what happens if someone fires first. Wilkinson survived court-martial proceedings, congressional investigations, and the Aaron Burr conspiracy trials, in which he served as the government's star witness against Burr, while being, by most historical assessments, at least as deeply implicated in Burr's schemes as Burr himself, and emerged from each of these crises not just intact, but in most cases with his official position enhanced. He was, in other words, exactly the kind of man who might need a private exit from the United States Capitol.
The connection between Wilkinson and the Capitol Tunnel is not direct. There is no document that says James Wilkinson ordered the construction of a passage beneath the Capitol's eastern foundation. But the circumstantial architecture of the connection is substantial enough to deserve careful examination. Wilkinson was in Washington during the period when Callum Bryce's deposition places the tunnel's construction, the winter of 1798. He had, at that time, extensive contacts within both the military establishment and the civilian government, including direct relationships with several of the individuals who had oversight responsibility for Capitol construction. He had demonstrated throughout his career a consistent pattern of creating private channels of communication and movement that operated outside official structures, secret correspondence routes, private financial accounts, relationships with intermediaries who could move information and materials without leaving traces in the official record. And he had, by 1798, accumulated a set of secrets that would have made a private exit from the center of American governmental power not merely convenient, but potentially essential to his survival. But Wilkinson is not the only figure whose profile fits the evidence. Because the tunnel, if it was built for the purpose of providing a private and deniable channel of movement to and from the Capitol, would have been useful not just to one man with secrets to protect, but to an entire category of early American political actors, men who operated in the space between official policy and unofficial reality, who needed to move information, money, or people in ways that could not be recorded in the public ledger. The early American Republic was full of such men. The period between 1793 and 1814, the entire span of the Capitol's original construction and first operational decades, was one of the most turbulent and genuinely dangerous periods in American political history. The French Revolutionary Wars and the subsequent Napoleonic conflicts created a geopolitical environment in which the young United States was under constant pressure from multiple competing imperial powers, each of which maintained active intelligence networks on American soil, and each of which had American political allies whose loyalties were, at minimum, complicated. The Federalist and Republican factions that divided American politics in this period were not simply disagreeing about domestic policy. They were, in some cases, aligned with different foreign powers in ways that made their political conflicts potential proxies for international rivalries with genuinely existential stakes. In this environment, the Capitol was not just a legislative chamber. It was a center of information, a place where the most sensitive intelligence about American military capacity, diplomatic intentions, financial condition, and political stability was regularly discussed, recorded, and physically present in the form of documents. Access to that information, or the ability to move sensitive materials in and out of that building without official scrutiny, would have been extraordinarily valuable to any number of actors, foreign and domestic, who were operating in Washington during this period. A tunnel beneath the Capitol's eastern foundation, built by night, paid for off the books, and known only to the small number of people who ordered and executed its construction, would have been an instrument of almost unlimited utility in this context.
It would have been a back channel in the most literal possible sense. A physical infrastructure for the conduct of business that could not be conducted through official channels. And when the British came in 1814, and the people who knew about the tunnel had a few hours to decide what to do with everything that back channel had been used to move and store over the preceding 16 years, they made the decision that people who operate in back channels always make when the official world comes too close. They went deeper. They put everything in the tunnel. And then they sealed it. The question that remains, the question that the construction records buried beneath the Capitol might have answered, if they were ever recovered, if they were ever read, is not just who built the tunnel or why. It is what the tunnel was used for across those 16 years of operation, what moved through it, what was stored at its terminus, what conversations were held in its darkness, what exchanges were made, what information passed between its stone walls that could not be spoken in the chambers above. We do not know. But we know this. Whatever it was important enough to bury twice. First in 1814, when the crates went down and the entrance was sealed. And again in 1977, when Daniel Harwick's inspection team found the wall and the report was spot was under anomalous infrastructure. Resolved. Resolved. As if the silence itself were a solution. As if entombment were the same thing as truth.
There is a particular kind of frustration that comes with historical research of this nature. It is not the frustration of hitting a dead end, of following a trail until it simply stops, until the documents run out and the evidence dries up, and you are left with nothing but the bare fact of your own ignorance. That kind of frustration is clean in its way. It has a definite shape. You know where you stand. You know what you do not know, and you can say so with precision and move on. The frustration of researching the Capitol tunnel is different. It is the frustration of a trail that never quite stops, that keeps producing new fragments, new corroborations, new pieces that fit the emerging picture with a consistency that random historical noise cannot explain, but that also never quite arrives, never produces the document that says, in plain, unambiguous language, here is the tunnel, here is who built it, here is what it was used for, here is why it was sealed. You are always one archive away from the answer. You are always reading around the edges of something that the official record has chosen not to say directly. This is, of course, exactly how institutional concealment works when it works well. It does not destroy evidence entirely. Destruction leaves its own traces, its own suspicious absences. It displaces evidence. It misfires it. It buries it in filing categories that bear no relationship to its content, surrounds it with irrelevant material, ensures that finding it requires knowing what you are looking for before you look. It maintains just enough plausible deniability to make any claim of deliberate concealment sound, to an outside observer, like the paranoid overinterpretation of ordinary archival disorder. But there is one more piece of evidence in this story, one more fragment that has not yet been examined, and it is, in some ways, the most remarkable piece of all. Not because it is the most dramatic, not because it provides the clearest direct evidence of the tunnel's existence, but because of where it came from, and what its existence implies about the longevity of the institutional knowledge surrounding the Capitol's hidden eastern passage. It came from inside the Capitol itself. In the spring of 2019, a junior staffer working in the office of a senior Senate committee chairman was tasked with organizing a storage room in the basement level of the Capitol, one of the numerous utility and storage spaces that exist in the building's lower levels, largely invisible to the tourists and visitors who move through the public areas above. The storage room in question had apparently not been systematically organized in some decades, and it contained, among the accumulated institutional detritus of a working legislature, a quantity of miscellaneous paper records that had been boxed and stacked without apparent system. The staffer, whose name has not been made public, and who spoke about this discovery only through an intermediary, was not a historian. She was not an archivist. She was a recent college graduate doing the kind of organizational work that falls to junior staff in large institutional offices everywhere. But she was, by the intermediary's account, a careful and curious person, and when she opened one of the older boxes and found that it contained not the administrative records she expected, but what appeared to be hand-drawn architectural diagrams on paper that felt significantly older than anything else in the room, she did not simply refile it. She photographed what she found. The photographs, 15 of them, taken on a smartphone, imperfect in their lighting and angle, but clear enough to read, show a series of architectural drawings executed in the drafting style of the early 19th century. They are not complete drawings.
They appear to be fragments, portions of larger plans, cut or torn from their original context, preserved together as if someone had deliberately assembled this specific subset of a larger set of documents. The drawings show foundation-level plans of a building that is recognizably, to anyone familiar with early Capitol architecture, the eastern section of the original Capitol structure. They show the foundation vaults, they show the storage chambers, and they show, rendered in the precise measured lines of professional architectural drafting, a passage running north by northeast from the eastern foundation, a passage whose dimensions, as readable from the scale notation visible in several of the photographs, are consistent with the measurements recorded in Josiah Meagh's 1816 survey. 4 feet wide, approximately 6 feet in interior height, running north by northeast. The drawings label this passage with a notation that is partially legible in the photographs. The first word appears to read, private, or possibly privy. The resolution of the smartphone photographs is not sufficient to be certain. The second word is clear. It reads, passage, private passage, or privy passage. Either way, a passage that was named, that was drawn, that was incorporated into what appeared to be official architectural plans of the Capitol's eastern foundation, and that has never appeared in any publicly available architectural record of the building.
The staffer reported her find to her supervisor, who referred it to the Capitol's administrative office, which referred it to the architect of the Capitol's office. The box and its contents were collected. The staffer was told that the materials would be properly catalogued and assessed. She asked, several weeks later, whether the assessment had been completed and whether the drawings had been identified. She was told that the materials had been reviewed and determined to be reproductions rather than original documents, copies of architectural drawings of no particular historical significance that had been misfiled decades earlier. She was satisfied with this explanation. She had the photographs, and through the intermediary who eventually brought this story to the attention of the research community that had been following the Capitol tunnel evidence since Carol Whitfield's footnote, those photographs eventually reached the 3 researchers, the retired archivist, the Georgetown graduate student, and the Richmond independent historian, who had been corresponding about the tunnel since 2009. The retired archivist, whose career had been spent handling early 19th century documents, examined the photographs carefully. He noted the paper tone, the ink oxidation pattern, the drafting style, the notation conventions. He noted the specific way in which the scale notation was formatted, a convention that, he wrote to his colleagues, was standard in American architectural drafting practice between approximately 1800 and 1825 and became obsolete thereafter. He noted the particular style of the lettering used in the passage notation, which was consistent with the hand lettering practices of trained draftsmen working in Washington in the first 2 decades of the 19th century. His conclusion, stated with the careful hedging of a man who understood the limits of photographic analysis, was that the drawings appeared to be consistent with original early 19th century architectural documents rather than later reproductions. He could not be certain. Photographic analysis has real limitations, but his professional judgment, offered after 40 years of working with documents of this period, was that what the staffer had found in that basement storage room was not a reproduction. It was a fragment of the original construction record, a fragment of the documentation that was supposed to have burned in 1814, a fragment that somehow had not gone into the tunnel with the rest, or that had come back out of the tunnel at some point in the intervening 2 centuries, perhaps during a subsequent construction project, perhaps during one of the Capitol's many renovation cycles, perhaps carried out by someone who knew what they were and chose to preserve them rather than destroy them, tucking them into a box in a basement storage room where they sat for decades, waiting for a curious junior staffer with a smartphone to open the wrong box on an ordinary spring afternoon in 2019. The implications of this fragment are significant in ways that go beyond the specific question of the tunnel's existence, because if even a portion of the Capitol's original construction record survived, if the documents that were supposed to have burned in 1814 did not all burn, or did not all stay buried, then the full record may be more recoverable than the official silence of 2 centuries suggests. Somewhere in the Capitol substructure, or in its basement storage rooms, or in the filing systems of the architect of the Capitol's office, there may be more boxes, more fragments, more pieces of a documentary record that has been displaced and obscured and misfiled, but never entirely destroyed. And somewhere beneath the Capitol's eastern foundation, behind a wall of dressed stone and early 19th century hydraulic cement, there may still be wooden crates, sitting in the dark, exactly where they were placed on the afternoon of August 24, 1814, waiting, as the tunnel itself has been waiting, for someone to finally open the wall and look. The question of whether that will ever happen, whether the institutional forces that have maintained the silence for 2 centuries will eventually yield to the accumulating pressure of the evidence, or whether the wall will hold for another 2 centuries, is not one that historical research alone can answer. It is a question about political will, about institutional accountability,
about whether the government of the United States is capable of looking honestly at the secrets that its predecessors chose to bury and deciding that the public interest in the truth outweighs the institutional interest in continued concealment. History, on this question, is not encouraging, but history is also not finished.
What does it mean for a democracy to keep secrets from itself? This is not a rhetorical question. It is not the kind of question that dissolves into abstraction if you press it hard enough. It is a question with a specific, concrete answer, an answer that the story of the Capitol Tunnel illuminates with a clarity that 2 centuries of institutional silence have not managed to dim. A democracy keeps secrets from itself by building the architecture of concealment into its own foundations, literally in this case, figuratively in the broader pattern that the tunnel represents. The passage beneath the Capitol's eastern foundation is not an anomaly. It is not a strange aberration in an otherwise transparent institutional history. It is an early and unusually tangible example of something that has recurred throughout American political history with sufficient regularity to constitute a pattern: the construction of parallel infrastructure, physical or procedural, that allows the real business of power to be conducted outside the view of the official record. We have grown accustomed to thinking about this kind of parallel infrastructure in abstract terms. We talk about back channels. We talk about off-the-books operations. We talk about the deep state, a term that has been so thoroughly weaponized by partisan politics that it has become almost useless as a descriptive category. Its original meaning, the permanent bureaucratic and institutional apparatus that operates with continuity across changes of elected government, buried under layers of ideological accusation and counter-accusation. But the Capitol Tunnel is not abstract. It is stone and mortar and darkness and dimensions. It is 4 feet wide and 6 feet tall and 138 feet long, and it was built by real men working real nights in the winter of 1798. And whatever passed through it physically, in the actual world, leaving actual traces that have survived 2 centuries of deliberate erasure. The concreteness of it matters, because when we talk about the parallel infrastructure of power in abstract terms, it is easy to treat it as a feature of some other era, some other political culture, some other version of American governance that we have since outgrown or reformed or left behind. The Capitol Tunnel does not allow that comfortable distance. It is there. It is physical. It is, to the best of current evidence, still there, still sealed behind its wall of early 19th century masonry, still containing whatever was placed in it on the afternoon of August 24, 1814. It has not been resolved. It has not been addressed. It has simply been maintained in a state of official non-existence by the same institutional mechanisms that have maintained that non-existence since Benjamin Henry Latrobe wrote about closing the eastern substructure against future interference in October 1815. And those institutional mechanisms are themselves worth examining, because they are not the mechanisms of dramatic conspiracy. They are not the mechanisms of shadowy cabals meeting in secret to coordinate their suppression of dangerous truths. They are, in their way, far more mundane and far more durable than any conspiracy could be. They are the mechanisms of institutional inertia, of the simple, grinding bureaucratic preference for the status quo that characterizes large organizations everywhere, in every era, under every political system. The Capitol Tunnel has been maintained in official non-existence not because generations of Capitol administrators have gathered in secret rooms to renew their oath of silence, but because the institutional default, when confronted with evidence of something anomalous, something that raises uncomfortable questions about past decisions and past actors, is to file it, to label it resolved, and to move on. This is how institutional memory works, not through active conspiracy, but through passive preference, not through the dramatic suppression of dangerous truth, but through the quiet, repeated choice to leave well enough alone. And this is why the tunnel matters beyond its own specific historical mystery. It matters because it is a case study in how democratic institutions manage their own inconvenient histories, how they balance the theoretical commitment to transparency that is foundational to democratic governance against the practical institutional preference for continuity, for stability, for not opening walls that have been sealed for 200 years, because opening them might require acknowledging that the people who sealed them had reasons for doing so that the institution would rather not examine too closely. The 3 researchers who have spent the better part of 15 years following this evidence, the retired archivist, the Georgetown graduate student who is now a tenured professor of American architectural history, and the Richmond independent historian, have reached different conclusions about what should be done with what they know. The archivist, the eldest of the 3, has become philosophical about it. He has spent his career watching institutions manage their own histories, and he is not surprised by what he has found. He is interested, he is engaged, but he is not shocked. He told his colleagues, in a letter written in 2020 that was shared with this researcher, that the tunnel is a perfect example of what he calls the archaeology of institutional embarrassment, the accumulated sediment of decisions that seemed reasonable at the time and look increasingly indefensible in retrospect, preserved beneath the surface of the official record because the cost of excavating them always seems higher than the cost of leaving them buried. The Georgetown professor is less philosophical. She has brought the evidence to the attention of congressional staff on 2 separate occasions, once in 2015 through a connection in the office of a Senate committee with oversight responsibility for the Capitol's physical infrastructure, and once in 2018 through a different connection in the House. On both occasions, she received the same response that Carol Whitfield received when she raised the question of Harwick's unresolved inspection report: initial courtesy, subsequent silence, and the clear institutional message that this was not a question that the relevant authorities wished to pursue. She has continued to pursue it anyway. She published a peer-reviewed article in 2022, a significantly more cautious and hedged piece than the joint paper that was rejected by 3 journals in 2011, but one that nonetheless laid out the core evidentiary case for the tunnel's existence with sufficient scholarly rigor to survive the review process. The article attracted modest attention in academic circles and almost no attention outside them. The architect of the Capitol's office did not respond to the journal's request for comment. The Richmond independent historian has taken the most unconventional approach. He has spent the past several years attempting to map the Capitol's subterranean infrastructure using ground-penetrating radar data, a non-invasive surveying technology that can detect subsurface voids and features without requiring physical excavation. Ground-penetrating radar has been used extensively in archaeological contexts to identify buried structures, and its application to the Capitol's eastern foundation would, in principle, be capable of confirming or refuting the existence of the tunnel without requiring anyone to open a wall or physically enter the substructure. The technology exists, the methodology is established, the application is straightforward. The obstacle is access. The Capitol's grounds are not public property in the sense that would allow an independent researcher to simply arrive with a GPR unit and begin scanning the eastern foundation. Access to the Capitol complex for research purposes requires institutional cooperation that the Richmond historian has sought through multiple channels over multiple years and has not received. He has approached the architect of the Capitol's office directly. He has sought congressional sponsorship for a formal research project. He has explored the possibility of partnering with academic institutions that might have greater leverage in negotiating access. Each avenue has produced the same result: courtesy, delay, silence. And yet the Richmond historian has not given up. Because ground-penetrating radar does not always require direct access to the surface above a target feature. Depending on the geometry of the situation, GPR data collected from adjacent accessible areas can sometimes detect features that extend within restricted zones. The Capitol's eastern grounds, the areas immediately surrounding the building's eastern foundation, include sections that are accessible to the public, or that have been accessible to researchers with appropriate credentials in the context of other approved projects. The Richmond historian has been quietly, carefully, methodically collecting GPR data from these accessible areas for the past 3 years, building a picture of the Capitol's subsurface geology one scan at a time, working toward the point at which he will have enough data to say, with the confidence that scientific methodology requires, whether there is or is not a void beneath the eastern foundation, consistent with the dimensions recorded in Josiah Meage's 1816 survey. He is not there yet, but he is closer than anyone has ever been. And when he gets there, when the data is complete, when the analysis is done, when the results can be stated with the precision that scientific evidence requires, the question of what to do with those results will be the most consequential question in this entire story. Because a ground-penetrating radar survey that confirms the existence of a subsurface void beneath the Capitol's eastern foundation, consistent in location and dimensions with the tunnel described in 2 centuries of fragmentary documentary evidence, will not be a footnote on page 847 of a 3-volume academic study. It will not be a recommendation for further investigation that can be filed under anomalous infrastructure, resolved. It will be physical, measurable, scientifically verifiable evidence of something that the official record has spent 200 years pretending does not exist. It will be, in the most literal possible sense, a crack in the wall. And walls, once cracked,
have a way of coming down.
We began this journey with fire, with the orange glow that turned the Washington sky into something that witnesses described as beautiful and terrible in equal measure, a beauty that came from destruction, a terror that came from the recognition that nothing, not even the stone and mortar embodiment of a nation's highest aspirations, was beyond the reach of violence and time. The Capitol burned in 1814, and in the burning, something was hidden. Something was carried below, placed in darkness, sealed behind a wall of dressed stone and hydraulic cement, and left to wait in silence while the Republic rebuilt itself above it, while the dome rose and the columns were set and the marble was polished, and the great experiment of American self-governance continued its uncertain, improbable, occasionally magnificent progress through history. 200 years of silence. 200 years of documents misfiled and inquiries deflected, and inspection reports buried under category headings designed to make them unfindable without prior knowledge of their existence. 200 years of institutional inertia, performing the same function that a wall of early 19th century masonry performs, not destroying the truth, but containing it, keeping it in the dark, ensuring that the cost of finding it remains just high enough that most people, most of the time, decide the search is not worth the effort. But here is what 200 years of silence cannot do. It cannot make the tunnel not exist. It cannot unmeasure Josiah Meagh's survey, cannot undepose Callum Bryce, cannot unwrite Edward Bartlett's diary entry about the floor-level opening and the unidentified men carrying crates into the darkness below the Capitol's eastern floor. It cannot unfind Daniel Harwick's partition wall, cannot unfootnote Carol Whitfield's page 847, cannot unphotograph the architectural drawings that a junior staffer found in a basement storage room in the spring of 2019 and had the presence of mind to document before the institution collected them and declared them reproductions of no particular historical significance. The silence has been maintained with considerable skill and considerable persistence, but the evidence has been maintained too, scattered, fragmented, displaced, buried in archival locations designed to obscure it, but present, stubbornly, irreducibly present. And presence is everything. Because history is not ultimately a contest between truth and concealment, it is a contest between patience and time. The people who sealed the tunnel in 1815 are gone. The people who misfiled Harwick's report in 1977 are in all likelihood gone or very close to it. The institutional interests that have perpetuated the silence across 2 centuries are real and persistent and not to be underestimated, but they are not eternal. They depend on the continued willingness of individuals within the institution to make the same choice, to look at the evidence and file it, to receive the inquiry and not respond, to label the anomaly resolved and move on, that their predecessors made. And that willingness, like all institutional habits, is subject to erosion, subject to the slow accumulation of outside pressure, subject to the particular kind of disruption that occurs when evidence reaches a critical mass, when it becomes sufficiently well documented, sufficiently widely known, sufficiently impossible to dismiss as the product of amateur speculation or archival misreading, that the cost of continued silence begins to exceed the cost of acknowledgement. We may be approaching that point. The Richmond historian's ground-penetrating radar project, when it is complete, will produce data of a kind that the institutional response has not yet had to contend with. Not a deposition from the early 19th century, not an inspection report from the 1970s, not a footnote in an academic study, but contemporary scientific measurement, hard numbers, verifiable methodology, the kind of evidence that cannot be labeled a reproduction of no particular historical significance and filed in an unmarked box. The kind of evidence, if it confirms what the documentary record suggests, will require the architect of the Capitol's office to either respond substantively or refuse to respond in a way that is itself a kind of response, a silence so loud and so pointed that it becomes paradoxically a form of confirmation. And there is something else, something that the story of the Capitol tunnel shares with every story of institutional concealment that has eventually come to light, every classified program eventually declassified, every sealed record eventually opened, every wall eventually breached. The something else is this. The institution that maintains the silence is never monolithic. It is always composed of individuals, and individuals are not uniformly committed to the institutional interest in concealment. Some of them are curious, some of them are troubled. Some of them, like the junior staffer who photographed the architectural drawings before handing them over, act on an instinct that they may not even fully articulate to themselves, an instinct that says that what they have found matters, that it should not simply disappear, that someone outside the institution should know it exists. These individuals are the cracks in the wall. They have always existed in every institution that has ever tried to maintain a silence of this kind. Patrick Magruder's letter, with its 2-hour gap that he chose not to explain, but also chose not to conceal, is a crack. Edward Bartlett's diary, with its careful description of things that a more prudent man might have left unwritten, is a crack. Callum Bryce's deposition, with its reluctant but precise testimony about the night excavations, is a crack. Daniel Harwick's inspection report, with its unambiguous recommendation for further investigation, is a crack. Carol Whitfield's footnote 312, placed on page 847 of a 3-volume academic study, with the careful aim of a person who understood exactly what she was doing, is a crack. The junior staffer's 15 smartphone photographs, now in the possession of researchers who understand their significance, are a crack. Cracks accumulate. And walls, as we have already noted, have a way of coming down when the cracks accumulate sufficiently. What will be found when this particular wall comes down, whether through the Richmond historian's GPR data or through a congressional inquiry sparked by sufficient public attention, or through the action of some future individual inside the institution who decides that the cost of continued silence is higher than the cost of truth, is a question that this story cannot yet answer. The crates may still be there, in the darkness of the sealed tunnel, containing whatever was deemed important enough to preserve and dangerous enough to hide on the afternoon of August 24, 1814. The construction records may be there, 21 years of documentation that would tell us not just about the tunnel, but about everything the tunnel was used for across the 16 years of its operation. The architectural drawings may be there in their complete form, the full plans rather than the fragments that a junior staffer found in a storage room 2 centuries later. Or the tunnel may be empty. The crates may have been removed at some point in the 2 centuries of silence, retrieved through some access point that left no trace in the documentary record, their contents dispersed or destroyed, or simply moved to a different concealment. The construction records may have genuinely burned, or may have been destroyed when the tunnel was sealed, the very documents that proved its existence, eliminated as a condition of its entombment. The tunnel may be nothing more than a stone-lined void, 4 feet wide and 6 feet tall, and 138 feet long, its walls damp with 2 centuries of groundwater infiltration, its floor empty, its silence the silence not of preserved secrets, but of a chamber that has simply outlasted the purpose it was built to serve. We do not know. That is the honest answer. We do not know what is in the tunnel, if the tunnel is indeed there. We do not know why it was built with sufficient certainty to say definitively that any single explanation, Wilkinson, foreign intelligence, the parallel infrastructure of early American political power, is the correct one. We do not know what was in the crates that Edward Bartlett watched being carried below the Capitol's eastern floor on the afternoon of August 24, 1814. We do not know what Thomas Munro meant when he wrote that the building documents had been disposed of as previously arranged. We do not know who the unidentified men were, or who sent them, or what they knew about what lay beneath the floor-level opening that Bartlett glimpsed as he turned to leave. What we know is the shape of the absence. We know that something was built, and hidden, and used, and sealed, and then hidden again, and then found, and then hidden again, with a consistency and a persistence across 2 centuries that random historical noise cannot explain. We know that the official record has a specific outline, a specific shape of omission that points towards something rather than away from it. We know that the evidence, fragmented and displaced as it is, fits together with a coherence that accumulates across sources and across centuries into something that is, if not proof, then the closest approximation of proof that the deliberate maintenance of institutional silence will permit. We know there is something beneath the Capitol's eastern foundation. We know it has been there for a very long time. And we know, because the history of institutional concealment teaches this above all else, that it will not stay hidden forever. Nothing does. The fire of 1814 was supposed to be an ending. The British put the Capitol to the torch, expecting to leave behind nothing but ash and the humiliation of a young republic that had dared to think itself secure. What they left behind instead was a mystery, a tunnel sealed in the chaos of destruction, a secret buried in the foundations of a rebuilt nation, a question that has persisted through 2 centuries of deliberate silence, and is still, tonight, still unanswered, still waiting, still
still in the dark, still beneath our feet. This has been Liturgy of Whispers. If this story reached something in you, if you found yourself leaning closer, listening harder, feeling the particular unease that comes from understanding that the ground beneath the most powerful building in the United States may contain something that 200 years of official silence has been working to keep from you, then leave that feeling in the comments. Tell us where you are. Tell us what time it is where you are listening. Tell us what you think is in the tunnel. Because the whispers belong to all of us, and the wall cannot hold forever.